Huawei, China's telecom giant, is back in the spotlight after allegedly getting caught off building a secret network for chips to skirt U.S. sanctions. A helmet, a compass, and 5 containers of fuel. One Chinese activist packed light while fleeing China for South Korea, traveling via jet ski. A tense supply drop in dangerous waters, and a standoff between Philippine and Chinese Coast Guard forces in the South China Sea. And inside China, 1 million unfinished homes and crowds of unpaid employees.
We're very worried.
They haven't paid us since January.
Will a Chinese property giant's debt crisis spill over to the rest of the country? What do you think? Let us know below and subscribe if you haven't already. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Chips, telecoms, and billions in funding from Beijing. China's telecom giant Huawei is back under fire. Washington-based Semiconductor Industry Association is warning that Huawei has found a way to skirt U.S. sanctions, building a slew of secret semiconductor facilities across China. That's in violation of U.S. blacklist laws. The nation's leading association on global chips telling Bloomberg that Beijing is reportedly funding the project to the tune of $30 billion. That's almost the same amount divided among multiple companies under the U.S. Chips and Sciences Act. The report noting that level of funding could give Huawei an edge. The White House says it's monitoring the situation and ready to take action. Huawei has been on the U.S. Commerce Department's entity list since 2019, meaning it's not allowed to get its hands on U.S. chip-making equipment. The U.S. upped export controls last October to restrict Chinese companies from getting certain advanced U.S. tech, such as semiconductors and chip-making gear. The move aimed to curb China's military capabilities. While Chinese companies are allowed to buy older and less advanced gear, blacklisted companies like Huawei need a special license. These exceptions are rare. While the report came out in April, the association is only now sounding the alarm. The group estimates there are over 20 of these facilities across China, with planned investments numbering over $100 billion by 2030. That's raising concerns that with enough experience, over time, Huawei could use these older generation technologies to progress. That's what happened with Taiwan's TSMC and South Korea's Samsung in the past, which are now global leaders in this industry. An over 180-mile journey across the sea, all to escape from China on a jet ski. Last week, South Korea's Coast Guard detained a Chinese man on its west coast. He's suspected of traveling from China's eastern Shandong province, carrying only a helmet, a compass, and 5 barrels of fuel to ensure he could complete the long trip. Upon arrival in South Korea, he got stuck on the muddy shore and had to call an emergency line for help. He was then taken into custody. The Coast Guard did not identify the man, but a South Korean activist and human rights group ID'd him as Chinese activist Kwon Pyong. Kwon was previously jailed for criticizing Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping when he tweeted a photo in 2016 wearing a T-shirt decorated with mocking names for Xi. NTD cannot independently verify his identity. The Chinese embassy declined to comment. Nearly 1 million homes unfinished and massive amounts of workers unpaid. The debt crisis linked to one of China's top property giants, Country Garden, is spilling over across the country. Here's a closer look at the ongoing impacts.
At this unfinished residential complex in the outskirts of the northern Chinese metropolis of Tianjin, construction has slowed to a quiet crawl. It belongs to Country Garden, China's largest property developer by sales volume before this year. But now it's mired in a debt crisis that's threatening to spill over into the rest of the world's second-largest economy.
This Country Garden project was stopped after we built the framework. We got a notice from management. They haven't paid us since January.
According to estimates from Japanese investment bank Nomura, Country Garden has nearly 1 million homes to complete. The developer has not publicly acknowledged that any of its projects have halted construction. But at 2 Tianjin projects Reuters visited on Friday, construction had partially or fully stopped, with workers complaining of months without pay.
We're very worried because since we arrived here in May, they've only given us living expenses of some $600 per person. We've not received a cent of other payments.
Once considered one of the more financially sound developers, Country Garden is now a bellwether of how the cycle has turned for developers. Its financial woes have added to the ongoing debt crisis in China's real estate sector, which accounts for roughly a quarter of the country's economy. And it's currently losing steam amid a housing slump and weak consumer spending. An investment manager at the Tianjin branch of Centerline Property Agency named Gao Fei told Reuters halted construction projects were relatively rare in the city, but confirmed there were projects that had slowed down development. According to Gao, China's real estate market rebounded slightly in the first quarter of 2023, but sales volume since declined, with most city housing markets remaining in a depressed state.
We have seen that many homebuyers are affected by a lack of income, and their home buying choices and what they can afford have been impacted in turn.
A representative of one Country Garden project that Reuters filmed said its registered employees were all being paid, while another said its contractor had promised to pay the workers by the end of the month.
U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is asking China for more transparency. Starting last week, China stopped releasing data on its youth unemployment rate. That's after the number hit record highs, over 20%. Beijing also raided a series of consulting firms in recent months. Sullivan said for the sake of global confidence and for the world to make sound economic decisions, it's important for China to maintain a level of transparency in its data publication. A delivery in dangerous waters. Two Philippine boats braved a dangerous confrontation with Beijing's forces Tuesday to deliver food, supplies, and a fresh crew of sailors to Filipino forces in the South China Sea. The troops there are guarding a contested shoal. To make the drop-off, the boats had to breach a Chinese Coast Guard blockade. Two Philippine Coast Guard vessels escorted the supply boats, with backup from a U.S. Navy plane circling overhead. But the mission wasn't smooth sailing. At least 4 Chinese Coast Guard ships blocked the boats in a near 5-hour standoff. Here's part of the tense exchange.
In the spirit of humanism, we will only permit the entry of Philippine cargo ships to the illegally grounded vessels. Government vessels are not allowed to enter. To avoid miscalculations, leave and keep follow.
BRP Sindangan, MRRV 4407, conducting lawful routine maritime patrol within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone.
Despite this message,
we are proceeding according to our planned route. Request to stay clear from our passage in accordance with the collision regulations. Over.
The Philippine Coast Guard ships were forced to stop. 4 Chinese Coast Guard ships and 4 suspected militia vessels surrounded them, while the 2 supply boats traveled over 4 miles further to make the drop-off at 2nd Thomas Shoal. All Philippine vessels sailed away afterward without further incident. The dangerous encounter marks the latest flare-up in the region. China claims much of the South China Sea as its own, overlapping areas claimed by the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Brunei. Beijing's claims were also ruled invalid by a 2016 tribunal. The waters are considered a front line in the U.S.-China rivalry. The U.S. is shutting its doors to Chinese officials over the Tibet issue. A new visa restriction imposed on Tuesday aims to tackle China's so-called forcible assimilation campaign. The project aims to enroll over 1 million Tibetan children into Beijing-run boarding schools.
From some as young as 4 years old are being forcibly taken from their parents and being sent to these boarding schools. I think there's a very systematic and in some ways a devious kind of a way of dismantling, layer by layer, piece by piece, different components of Tibetan culture, Tibetan identity.
The Chinese Communist Party deployed troops to occupy Tibet in the 1950s. After that point, Tibet's highest spiritual and political leader, the Dalai Lama, was forced to flee to India. Beijing immediately lashed out over Washington's travel curb, which blocks Chinese officials involved in the issue from entering the U.S. Beijing responded that Blinken should cancel the curbs immediately or be ready for a resolute response from China. The dispute erupted just ahead of the U.S. Commerce Secretary's trip to Beijing next week. Updates on the TikTok ban saga. Montana's Attorney General is asking a federal judge to allow the state's full and complete ban on the app to take effect, despite TikTok's lawsuits to stop it. Montana seeks to outlaw the app over fears that pro-Beijing misinformation could sway public opinion and harm Americans. It's the first state in the U.S. to support a full ban. Montana's Attorney General said Monday the state legislature and governor did the right thing in prohibiting TikTok from operating in Montana. He says that legally, Montana has the right to ban products it deems harmful and that the ban doesn't violate free speech. TikTok is owned by Chinese internet giant ByteDance. The company filed a lawsuit in May trying to block the first-of-its-kind ban, arguing that it violates the First Amendment right to free speech, both for the company and its users. Montana's ban is due to take effect in January. Over half of U.S. states have outlawed the app from government-managed devices, citing national security risks. New York City is among the latest to do so, echoing similar concerns. What's driving the new race to the moon? Major powers like the U.S., China, and the EU are racing to explore the space rock's uncharted South Pole region. Given India's recent lunar landing there, what makes the South Pole so important? Here's the story.
Rough terrain makes landing difficult, but the prize could be historic. Ice that could be used to extract fuel, oxygen, and drinking water. Russia's Lunar 25 craft had been scheduled to land on the South Pole this week, but spun out of control on approach and crashed. Yuri Borisov is the head of Russia's space agency.
The race for the development of the natural resources of the moon has begun, and in the future, the moon will become a platform for deep space exploration, an ideal platform.
Astronomers have wondered about water on the moon for centuries, which is 100 times drier than the Sahara Desert. It was only in 2020 that NASA confirmed the existence of water there. India sent up its Chandrayaan-3 lunar lander last month, after the Chandrayaan-2 failed in 2019.
Leaders of the 5 BRICS nations are meeting for a second day of talks on Wednesday. It's part of a 3-day summit in South Africa, joined by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. For a bloc often seen as a counterweight to the West, this week's annual summit holds more than just chit-chat. First, both China and Russia are voicing their grievances against Western powers. Addressing the summit by video, Russian President Vladimir Putin accused the West of provoking the war in Ukraine. In a similar complaint, the Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping urged the BRICS member nations to reject Western criticism of China's political model and called for accelerating the BRICS expansion. On Wednesday, South Africa's foreign minister told the press that the bloc had agreed on expansion plans. She added that further details would be provided by the end of the summit. Beyond that, India's prime minister called for BRICS cooperation on developing a satellite constellation, highlighting India's successful moon mission this week. While Brazil's president spoke in favor of de-dollarization between the BRICS members. Putin says Russia would assume chairmanship of the group next year, which rotates annually. Moscow will also host the group's summit. Another big story to look out for, China is in the red zone. A U.S. commander warns that China's overseas economic goals could easily flip into military backup. Is China edging closer to America's doorstep? Stay tuned for more details coming up tomorrow on China in Focus. That's all for today's China in Focus on YouTube. We're now sharing a shortened version of our program here after being demonetized for 2 years. Here's what to look out for in our second half. A new age space race focused on the moon's heavily cratered South Pole. India just celebrated a successful mission. But what's next for the U.S. and China in lunar exploration? Plus, Beijing's so-called huge breakthrough in laser weaponry. Is Chinese technology outpacing the U.S.? We sat down with Rick Fisher, Senior Fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center, for details. The full episode is available on our partner platform, Epic TV. To sign up, click the link down below. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you tomorrow.